Welcome everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. My name is Mr. Aejis and I will be your teacher for this session. I am a teacher in the real world. I stream health and wellness lessons on my streams here on Twitch and YouTube. I stream variety video game content, but today we're going to have more of an op-ed. This is going to be more of a discussion than a lesson. Something that's been on my mind for a while, and it's the term neurodivergent. It's not a term that I like very much. So we're going to talk a little bit about why I hate the term neurodivergent. So let's begin. First, I want to make sure that we emphasize that this is about how we're talking about our minds and not denying differences or diagnoses. This is about self-reflection, and this is open-ended. I want to make clear that I'm here to interrogate the word, not people's experiences. You can agree, you can disagree, it's not the end of the world. We're trying to get some clarity here, not have any conflict. So I want to discuss the usefulness or lack thereof of this term, not necessarily the people who use it. This is, of course, my own perspective. I'm bringing this up because I want things to be better for everyone, including myself. I think, in short, the term neurodivergent fails at the one job that a category is supposed to do: to actually differentiate. And hello, Snow Fox. Climbed right out of that little trash can. Thank you so much for coming by. I think the term obscures rather than clarifying things. That is, it makes it more difficult to understand what a person means when they have a condition considered to be neurodivergent. What it means when someone says that they are neurodivergent. I think it can lead to inaccurate understanding. As a term meant to help people understand that a person is living with a particular condition or set of symptoms, instead of helping that person quickly and easily with a convenient shorthand know what that person is dealing with, can sometimes do the opposite and lead them to presume about you instead of help them understand you better. We're going to talk about why that is very shortly. The term is unfortunately functionally empty. Because it is so empty and nebulous, it can be filled with a whole lot of people's misconceptions, preconceptions, misunderstandings. So rather than providing a useful umbrella with useful borders to help people understand each other, that lack of boundaries means that it just keeps accumulating different meanings to different people. Initially, the term was invented or described to help emphasize that there is a wide variety of human experiences, and that people who have these very different types of perceptions and behaviors should be given understanding and accommodation. And that's very true. But that meaning very quickly began to deteriorate. And I would agree, Henry. It's not helpful that, in general, mental health is something not talked about too seriously. For me, it leads to a lot of confusion. Because the very first thing you need to do when you're trying to differentiate people, especially if you're trying to differentiate one group of people from what's considered normal or typical, well, you need to decide what typical means. How do we compare someone with a neurodivergent mind to a typical mind? What does a typical mind mean? So that's what kind of behaviors, perceptions, emotional states, cognitive abilities do typical people tend to have? And Kyla, I am a teacher in the real world. This is my virtual classroom. This is not too formal. On the weekends, in between my regular types of variety VTubing game streams, I give lessons on things. Today, it's more of a discussion. I'm just kind of giving my opinion on the term neurodivergent as someone who is considered such. So feel free to agree or disagree. So how do we define what typical means? What is typical functioning in these areas? If we don't know that, how do we know if someone is diverging from it? There doesn't seem to be a meaningful threshold to measure. There certainly isn't any definition that seems consistent across people's age, across different cultures, societal expectations, different environments and upbringings. The way that someone exhibits, manifests neurodivergent traits can be very different depending on their age, how they were raised, comorbid conditions, and even what's typical can also be very different across age, culture, environment, personality. Are we comparing moving targets? Do we define it as simply someone who doesn't have one of the conditions? Is it really just having or not having a condition that is considered neurodivergent? Even if we did break it down to that binary state, yes or no, what conditions then? Because obviously ADHD and autism are what people think of when they think of neurodivergent. But it also includes things like dyslexia and dyscalculia. Learning disabilities are classed as neurodivergent, depending on who you ask. Some other mental health conditions like bipolar disorder and other personality disorders are considered to be neurodivergent, depending on who you ask again. Thank you so much, Hellbug, the 23rd Hellbug. I'm sure this is the best of all 23 Hellbugs. Welcome. Thank you so much for enrolling in my little class. And yes, Kyla, again, depending on who you ask, some people consider dyslexia, dyscalculia to be neurodivergent conditions, and some people don't. To me, this is another great example of how nebulous it is, even within conditions. Some of them are considered ND or neurodivergent and some aren't. How do we decide? Who decides if one of these conditions is or isn't neurodivergent? Yes, and exactly, Panima. Autism itself has an entire spectrum. We've got spectrums within spectrums. It's spectrums all the way down. Yo, dog, we heard you like spectrum, so we put a spectrum in your spectrum. Oh, Kyla, there's also dysgraphia. So it'd be like dyslexia, but for writing, for organizing your thoughts. I'm not an expert on these, but those are some of them. And yes, some other mental health conditions are considered that. Different personality disorders. Yeah, so there's dyslexia, which is the challenge of reading, dyscalculia, challenge with numbers, and then dysgraphia, the difficulty with writing. Those are the three that I'm aware of, at least. So we can't even really decide what goes under this umbrella. Under my umbrella. I gotta stop singing. So what do you think? You think that there should be more things added to this? More conditions considered neurodivergent? Or maybe fewer? Of course, Kyla, very much welcome all of your thoughts. I mean, as long as they can be legally shared here. Oh, Henry Barry, Fantasia, the thing where you can't really see things with your imagination. I would imagine people do consider that to be divergent. But it's not something that comes up very often, so we don't really think about it. Now, see, I have ADHD and some of these conditions, others that I will not discuss here. I am comfortable talking about my ADHD. Can be quite limiting, can be something that significantly impairs my function. So I'm considered neurodivergent. I've been tested for autism, trust me. That I have borderline traits of other conditions. Not borderline personality disorder. Not that there's anything wrong with, you know what I mean. Anima, you think we could use more scientific terms rather than trying to group them together? Kyla, you grew up with dyslexia. Learned that people can cope with it depending on the person. For you, the psychologist said you can cope with it and had years of speech therapy. Read and write, got rid of your speech issues. You've managed to find ways to adapt, cope with it, your coping skills. And that's the goal. It's to help people adapt and cope so that they can function as well as they want to in society without needing anything else. Empress, you say you're a person with autism. I think we're all multifaceted. I couldn't agree more. I had a feeling that there would be a good number of people who are neurodivergent in our viewership, especially since the streamer themselves is neurodivergent. It took a lot for me to adapt, to go from someone who dropped out of high school, someone with a master's degree, a couple bachelor's degrees, teacher. It's wonderful accomplishments, but not without a lot of difficulty and struggle, and eventually medication. But if we are going to divide these two concepts, typical and divergent, we'll need to have some kind of axis. What is the axis? Is it binary, yes or no? Is it having one of the conditions that is considered neurodivergent? Is it a yes, no, you have that condition or you don't? Perhaps it's the number or severity of symptoms. You see, someone can have a lot of the symptoms of, for example, autism, but not be diagnosed with it. Maybe they don't have autism, they just have some of the symptoms. But what if those symptoms are very limiting? What if they are very severe? What if it impacts their function as much or more than if they did have autism? Are they considered neurodivergent, even if they don't actually have the condition? And where you're going to soon be tested to see if you have ADHD? Well, the best part about that is, one way or the other, you know, and you know the path forward. For me, diagnosis and medication were extremely helpful. So along with that severity of symptoms, is it the functional impairment that really matters, determining if someone is neurodivergent? If someone has a lot of the symptoms of one of the conditions considered neurodivergent, but it doesn't really affect them that much, they function in life most like anyone else. Are they divergent from typical? Is it just social perception? Is it society that decides, yes, that person is neurodivergent by virtue of how severe their symptoms are, what conditions they have? And not to worry at all, Kyla. I think it's more aspects of the brain, not necessarily one side or another. Some aspect of your brain. What about people who do meet one of these conditions but don't have a significant impact on their life? What some people might call masking. And what about the opposite? What about a person who doesn't have a neurodivergent condition, doesn't have many of the symptoms, but what they do have, the things they do struggle with, are a big challenge for them. Very hard to deal with. It's a big struggle. Sort of min-maxed. But that one maxed out symptom is really tough. Thanks for dropping in, Sylvie. Hope you enjoy the conversation when you get the chance to check it out. There is some disagreement between the scientific and clinical aspects and what society currently tends to think neurodivergent means. So who's right? The spectrum, as it's sometimes called, whether it's referring to the neurodivergent general spectrum of behavior or autism specifically, it falls short in my estimation. Because it can't really be that 1 or 0, on or off, yes, you have one of the conditions, or no, you don't. For all of those reasons we were just questioning earlier. Most people consider it to be a spectrum, like this line here, this singular line graph, with neurodivergent on one side and neurotypical on the other. And the more divergent from typical you are, farther to the left, or closer and closer to typical, with whatever it is here at the farthest right end that is the most typical person in the world. But if this is the spectrum, where do we place these two hypothetical people? Person A, who has high levels of functional impairment due to a few symptoms that are considered consistent with neurodivergent conditions. Or person B, who is diagnosed with one of these conditions, exhibits most of the symptoms, but only has minor dysfunction to their ability to function in society. Where on these lines, where on this line, this spectrum, do we place person A and person B? There's no right or wrong answer. This is not a quiz. This is our opinions. Where do we think they go? Yes, Empress. Typical meaning neurotypical. Not next to each other because they will cause friction, Rao says. So where would we think they belong? Maybe close to each other. It depends, Ponyway, yeah. I feel like the person that struggles more is closer to neurodivergent. And that could very well be the case. I think that might be what I would say. And that sort of illustrates the general idea. Is this axis just self-referential? That is, does X simply equal how neurodivergent you are? Because then it's not all that useful. Then it really is just it depends Now, of course, we don't just have to judge things based on one axis. We can do two axes. We can do an X and Y. We can do a multi-dimensional spectrum. We can do two sides. We can do two axes. Say if we picked number and severity of symptoms, and if both were high, you would be down in this quadrant here with neurodivergent, and otherwise you'd be up here with typical. And what about these other two sides? Where are these ones at? Are they just other? And is typical right in the middle, or is it all the way in the top right? What are these quadrants? Do we pick number and severity of symptoms? But if every category includes divergence, then the categories don't really have a lot of meaning. Henry, some people would consider epilepsy to fall into it. There are some overlaps in symptoms, or rather, overlaps in people who have them. People who have autism are more likely to have epilepsy. So that would be difficult to really parse out what's the cause and effect, I think. Do people who have epilepsy exhibit more symptoms of autism because it's part of their condition, or is it because more people with autism tend to have epilepsy? I don't know. What if we went even farther? Even if we added more and more variables, started looking at this three-dimensionally? What if we had a three-axis, three-dimensional cube, and we looked at where neurodivergent people clustered and where neurotypical people clustered? Well, then of course there's going to be clusters of other people. Some of them overlapping with neurodivergent, some with neurotypical, maybe some with neither. What do we categorize these people as? Or is it really just that there's a cluster of people we consider neurodivergent and everything else is neurotypical? Then what's the neurodiversity? Does this help? Does this categorization help? And what would it help? How does this help people? How does the term neurodivergent help people? And this is, again, neither right nor wrong. Think about that and chime in if you like, because it'll come up a little bit later. So these differences are very real. They certainly exist between these two groups of people. But are these people that should be lumped together all by themselves? Are all of these people people who should be lumped together? But what does this matter, right? People might ask. It's not that big a deal. I'm thinking too much about it. Not that deep. But words do have important meaning. Especially on something as important as our mental health, our social interaction, our ability to function. What are some of the results from this? Part of what I think happens is that a lot of our broad experiences are becoming pathologized. That is, things that we're going through are being seen through the lens of a pathology or underlying issue, something that's wrong with us, rather than it being a human experience. People start to interpret a lot of wide experiences that many people have as something wrong with them, or due to some underlying neurological cause. Whether it's social discomfort, distractibility, sensory issues, things that might be common to others are seen as some kind of underlying pathology. Certainly there are levels to this, but many people have some of these experiences on smaller levels. And again, it can be down to culture and environment, individual personality, where it might not have anything to do with a neurological condition or having a personality disorder. It might just be ordinary human variability. I've taken to call this the junk drawer phenomenon. I haven't heard people describe it this way before, but it keeps coming up because every now and then discourse gets back started on social media where someone will post a picture of or talk about when they were growing up. Their family had a drawer in the kitchen that had a bunch of loose bits and bobs and string and paper clips and scissors and old batteries. And they say, you know, you grew up in a Lebanese family if you had a kitchen drawer full of rubber bands and paper clips and old coupons and stuff growing up. Old crumpled up plastic bags. And then everyone chimes in and says, no, everyone had that. Almost everyone's family grew up with a junk drawer. And next time it's Italian, next time it's, you know, your family's from New York or wherever. People take experiences they had growing up thinking that they were different and not normal, not understanding that these are actually pretty broad, general experiences that a lot of people have. Yeah, you're both finding that out today? Me too. Because my family definitely had the junk drawer. And it is actually a pretty wide phenomenon. Common experiences get pathologized. And so normal human variation can become seen as symptoms. I think this junk drawer analogy also works because some of these neurodivergent conditions are just sort of thrown into this junk drawer called neurodivergence. Conditions that might not have a lot of overlap, or might have overlap but not too significantly, or they're just here because they don't really fit anywhere else. We'll just throw ADHD in here with dyscalculia. We'll put bipolar disorder in here with autism, so that there's a junk drawer that covers them all, this umbrella term. Yes, Henry Bear. Some people, they really liked the idea that their experiences growing up were unique, rather than it actually being fairly common. Some of the other issues that can arise from this are that we're ignoring cultural and environmental differences. It might be a hot take that gets me canceled, but a lot of things that can be seen as symptoms of a neurodivergent condition can stem from very different causes. It can just stem from a way a person was socialized growing up. It can stem from trauma response. Be the result of cultural differences, rather than being a symptom, rather than being a pathology. But sometimes the symptoms aren't symptoms. It's just a person's individual differences or the way that the person was socialized growing up, their nurture rather than nature. And if the symptoms don't come from a pathology, if they're not symptoms, Oreo lion, oh, kids love to throw them dodgeballs. Oh, thanks, welcome. If some of these symptoms people are struggling with aren't actually symptoms, do we consider that still to be neurodivergent? That makes it all better. Oh, thanks for the cheers and the bits, Emporio. I appreciate it. My bruised skin will heal. We got to drive home this sort of scientific problem. Of course, there are social problems with it, but what about the science? Well, the conditions we're talking about that are considered part of the neurodivergent umbrella, they have very different causes. They have very different correlations. They have different comorbidities. We were just talking about how people who have autism are more likely to have epilepsy. I don't think that's true of, say, dyslexia. The treatments, the therapies that work best for each of these conditions can be very different. And the symptoms can manifest very differently over time and over the course of someone's life. Or you wonder if your ADHD and autism symptoms are actually caused by death of your parents' trauma, only noticed after they passed. And that can be very true in that perhaps the symptoms were minor and they manifested themselves over time. You noticed them. I was not diagnosed with ADHD until I was an adult. I grew up thinking that my experience, all of my distractibility, my difficulty focusing, all of my hyperactivity as a kid, I thought that was what everyone else was like too. I thought that was the universal experience. And Hikaru the Cosmic Oni, been enjoying the discussion. I'm very glad to hear that. That's the purpose of these kinds of streams. You know, the lessons are great, but I'm thinking about doing more of these where we just have a nice conversation. Yes, it is very different, Anima, when you grow up. How do kids just play together? Rao thought as a child. Exactly. I knew kids when I was growing up that very much had autism. But were never given any treatment by their parents. They were very religious. They didn't believe in that. So they were definitely neurodivergent, but they would never have gotten any kind of treatment or help for it. I think, for example, when people tell someone that they have neurodivergence, there's a lot of presumptions people are going to make about that. A lot of people are going to assume that means autism. But as we've been saying, neurodivergence also includes dyslexia. So if you tell someone that, say, at work, because you may need an accommodation, you still need to then explain the specific symptoms or issues, the things you might need help to accommodate. So what's really the purpose of the term neurodivergent if you still need to explain the specific condition and the specific symptoms? And if you have, say, dyslexia, the things that would help you would be extremely different than the things that would help someone who has autism. For a term that's meant to be a useful shorthand to help others understand and accept that you have these different challenges, it doesn't seem to do a very good job of that. Oof! Owie. A dyslexic person working at a hospital, that would be tough. But there are a lot of therapeutic methods, a lot of treatments that can be done. I've tutored people with dyslexia. But it is a challenge and something that they might need accommodation for at work. But they would talk about their specific symptoms with dyslexia and not I have neurodivergence or I'm neurodivergent. Because does that person need help with feeling overwhelmed and overstimulated at times? Or do they need help with the symptoms of dyslexia? Someone who has bipolar disorder, which is considered neurodivergent in many cases, would need very different help and accommodations than someone who has ADHD. So what's really the thread that ties those two people together? Why does both being considered neurodivergent help them, or help the rest of society understand them better? Or does it? Identification can be very powerful. Labels can be very helpful, and they can help people find common language and support for each other. We want to say, normalize the idea we can talk about our mental health. But if someone says, I have mental illness, yes, we can be very understanding and empathic and try to help people. But mental illness covers a wide range of things. Does that person struggle with depression? Do they have bipolar disorder? Do they suffer from panic attacks? Do they have obsessive compulsive disorder? Do they have autism or ADHD? So it's good to normalize talking about mental health and telling everyone that it's okay. But we don't lump them all together and say, I'm a person with mental illness. Not very often. We might talk about our specific symptoms or our conditions so that we can find out the treatments that work best for us, find out the therapies that will help us best, find the accommodations that we need so that we can live and function in society like everyone else. So this is not judgment of the term or people, but for us to consider. Labels can flatten our experiences. That is, they can make our struggles seem immutable. These identity labels can empower us, can make us feel like we're not alone. There are other people like us. There is a term that describes people like me, but it can also confine. These labels can empower us, but they can also confine us to these little boxes. And I think it can also sometimes obscure the experiences that people who really struggle with some of these issues have. The example that comes to mind for me is a lot of people will joke about intrusive thoughts. You'll see a lot of joking on social media like, oh, I almost cut my bangs, I almost let my intrusive thoughts win. When people who struggle with intrusive thoughts are potentially desperately struggling daily not to scream out awful things. They have significant function concerns. A big struggle for them. It equates some silly kind of frivolous, trivial understanding of the term with people who really struggle with that issue. And on the other side, people who do struggle with those conditions can lead to a little bit of learned helplessness. That is, the things you struggle with can feel like they're immutable, unchangeable traits. And in some cases, traits are what they are. I can't stop being a person who has ADHD. I can't just stop having it. But that isn't who I am. And even if it was, I would want it to be specifically who I am and not this broad umbrella that includes so many things that I'm not. I don't have dyslexia or dyscalculia. Reagan, you feel like OCD has a similar problem to intrusive thoughts? Very, very true. A lot of people will joke about being OCD. Oh, I'm so OCD. It happens so often. When people who struggle with OCD, they understand. It is not a joke at all. Significant challenge to our daily function. To see that equated to people's flippant jokes about it, well, that doesn't really help either. The next issue that we can discuss is moral exemption. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by moral exemption? Well, first, that stereotypes can become expectations. You may have heard the concept of the curse of low expectations in the context of education, where students, if the teacher has low expectations for them, tend to meet those low expectations. If you assume things about people, sometimes they turn out to be true. But also, that there can be reduced accountability. You've probably thought about this, maybe in different words. Maybe you have seen this happen, where someone's behavior is excused because of a condition. And this goes back to the flattening that we talked about earlier, where someone's traits, behaviors are seen as immutable characteristics. If they're seen as immutable characteristics and a person can't help it, then they feel like they have less accountability. Less responsibility. And other people might reinforce that. Well, they can't help it, that's just the way they are. This is not to say that people are acting in bad faith, but they are unintended consequences. But stereotypes can become expectations, and expectations become outcomes. For both society, making assumptions about a person, and that person making assumptions about themselves. This can unfortunately lead to burdening people who do struggle with these conditions with the misconceptions and even suspicion of society. That, well, you can't trust that person with that because you know that those people struggle with blank. I don't want people to think that of me. I wouldn't want to think that of other people. We don't want to replace people's individuality, their unique personal strengths and weaknesses, their history. We don't want to lose all of that nuance and reduce it down to a caricature. In a sense, a caricature that is made up of a dozen different conditions, all of which are unique in themselves. Autism being different than ADHD, being different than dyslexia, being different than bipolar disorder, being different than other learning disorders. This homunculus we've made, called a neurodivergence, is a caricature of caricatures of all these conditions. It doesn't just generalize the problems, it also generalizes what could genuinely help people. Touched on a little bit already how the accommodations, the needs that people have are very different between these conditions. If a business wants to be more accommodating to potential employees that are neurodivergent, well, they can't really look at what's going to help them be more accommodating to neurodivergence because That's too nebulous. They would look at how can we be more accommodating to people who have autism, to people who have ADHD, people who have dyslexia. Because again, someone might not have any of those conditions, but might have some symptoms of them. And this does go to the great point that accessibility and accommodation helps everyone. It's the curb cutout effect. You know what a curb cutout is? It's at the end of a curb. Where's that slope that goes into the crosswalk? They aren't there just for people who have disabilities, of course. It's there for joggers. It's there for people pushing strollers, people lugging carts, people who are on crutches. Having that curb cutout helps everyone, whether they have a disability, permanent disability, a temporary one, or any other symptom or issue that might require a curb cutout, or simply makes it more convenient for them. So a person might not have any condition that is considered neurodivergent, but they have symptoms. They have symptoms, and being more accommodating to those symptoms might help them. We should be progressing toward a society that accommodates as many people as possible, as much as possible. Is this goal served by using neurodivergent as a big umbrella term for so many of these conditions? It might be more convenient to just say the term neurodivergent than to talk about autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and so on. But it may not be as helpful. Going back to the more scientific part of it, how much has this perception affected research? And then, very importantly, how much has it leaked into our application and our understanding in schools, in businesses, in government policy, in therapy and medicine, and in our media representations? Putting these conditions together, for example, students who have IEPs or 504s, all lumped together as neurodivergent, are they each being genuinely accommodated for their struggles, or are they being taught that they're all part of the same group? Are they being taught learned helplessness? Are they being taught that their situation is not necessarily unique and individual, they're just like all these other kids who have this problem? In that case, potentially losing all of the benefit of the term neurodivergent, that is, to help someone recognize that they are unique, they're different, they're diverse. And then, of course, since we've talked about media representation, we have to talk about media representation. How the term neurodivergent has come to simply encapsulate all of the possible conditions, and usually are put all into one particular character. There's no nuance. It just becomes a caricature of a caricature. Perception can shape expectation. What people expect someone who is neurodivergent to be like, what they perceive neurodivergence to be. And then, hey, if you aren't like that, are you really neurodivergent, they'll think? You can't really have autism. You don't act like the people I've seen who have autism. But the people they've seen who have autism are media figures, fictional characters, or just Tumblr descriptions. people who think, well, that means you have a fixation, right? Is trains your thing? And then I think, I don't have fixation like that. What are you talking about? Yeah, anima can become a shell. Or I'll say the school lumped you in with everyone. Not only potentially embarrassment, painted with the same brush when all of your needs were very different. Yes. Very much what we're talking about here. The same brush when some of these conditions are so different. But then we have to get to the next problem. And it's the one that comes right after our horrible media representations of people with autism. And it's the other horrible representation. It's a word. You might know the word I'm talking about. Some of you like the word. I know that. I know that some of you like this word I'm about to say, and that's okay. Like I said from the top, this is an opinion section, a discussion, no right or wrong answer. But I got to talk about the term neurospicy. I hate it. I hate it. I feel like it trivializes. It treats it as a joke. It equates being neurodivergent to being special, aka spicy. That is, more interesting than others, more varied. Someone who is more deserving or requiring of toleration for their behavior. They couldn't handle my neurospicy takes. Now it can just be a fun joke, that's fine. But people very much seriously use this, thinking that they're neurospicy. They're different. And to me, this just feels like that meme of the creative people versus regular people, where a regular person is cooking a turkey in the oven and they're just staring at it, and the creative person is cooking a turkey in the oven, but they're dressed in a fantasy outfit and there's a tiny dragon in the oven that's cooking the turkey. I don't really like the term neurospicy. We've talked about the term cringe before and how I don't think that we should be worried about cringe and we should embrace cringe and all that. There are a few things that I feel are genuinely cringy, and for me, this is one of them. I would rather people just call me names than call me neurospicy. Don't put the dragon in the oven. Well, you would be the supplier of the heat, so you'd be fine, dragon. But I had to be candid here. I don't like the term neurospicy. In fact, I'll give you my personal position as a whole. Even though I am diagnosed with conditions people consider neurodivergent, I don't want to apply that term to myself. Diagnoses can be very real without defining your identity. I'm not opposite to someone who is neurotypical. I'm not the opposite of typical. I'm not the opposite of divergent. My identity, my struggles, the things I deal with, the executive dysfunction I've been having over the last couple weeks, my ADHD, yes, those are conditions, and there is a pathology. But my identity is not a pathology. I want to humanize myself and not pathologize myself. I don't want to feel like my growth is bounded by those conditions, as if those traits are unchangeable, or at least not influenceable. There isn't any term that should overshadow my unique challenges, because my neurodivergence is not like anyone else's, and theirs isn't like mine. what should we do instead? What's the constructive alternative? Well, we've been touching on it thus far, and it's to focus on the specific struggles, whether it's specific conditions or the symptoms within them. Each one has its own different meaningful challenges. It can be executive function, the sensory sensitivities, emotional regulation, attention and distractibility, social awareness. We want to reinforce that these are all different from each other, that accommodating them requires different things. Some people will need each of them, some people will need one of them. This is about precision, not erasing anyone's identity. Rather, the opposite, affirming that identity and the specific, unique personal struggles that they have within it. So, to wrap it up, yes, the concept is very popular, but it's also very unstable. It's shifting all the time. What it means, what it includes, isn't even clear by people who like and support and apply the term. It compresses multiple, very distinct conditions and traits and behaviors into a single overlapping identity, which can cause people to pathologize themselves. And it can make scientific understanding of it a little muddier. Instead, I think we should be more precise in our vocabulary. And yes, as Ponima says, be more open to talking about these topics so that that vocabulary gets into the popular lexicon. So when you talk about, say, struggles that you have with ADHD symptoms or dyslexia, people know what you're talking about. Be precise in our vocabulary, respect all of those individual differences, and to again humanize rather than pathologize people. So I don't think that you should abandon the term necessarily, but we should all think more critically about not only what it does, but what we want it to do. What is it that we actually want from the term neurodivergent? Is it a convenient shorthand so that people know that you struggle with some kind of symptom within that arch? Is it to help us find each other? To be connected? Then that's incredibly useful on its own. And we should use that term for that context. It would be not unlike people who, again, have a, say, mental illness, looking for support. Excellent thing to do. But then we, of course, break it down more specifically into what specific mental illness the person is struggling with and needs help with. Because the things that someone with bipolar disorder needs help with would be very different than someone who has OCD or attachment disorder or avoidance, histrionic personality disorder, major depression. There's a galaxy of unique human experiences that should be accommodated whenever possible. But I think it's therefore important to humanize it as well as understanding the pathology. So that's my spiel on the topic of neurodivergence, the term neurodivergent. I don't necessarily feel it's all that useful, apart from helping people find others who have a overlapping, somewhat related set of conditions. But it is becoming more and more empty a term, and unfortunately applied to more and more things, when we should be more and more precise. Otherwise, everything just starts to be called autism. Because that's what people think when they hear neurodivergent. We all know that. When someone hears neurodivergent, they think, well, it's autism or some autism-like condition. Now, if people with autism were accommodated as well as they should be in society, maybe that wouldn't be such an issue. But I think we all know they're not. So if you have any other questions, let me know. What do you think? So that's my take. That's my opinion, my op-ed. It's just one person's opinion. One person who is neurodivergent. How they think about it. Again, not to tell people not to use the term or that it's a judgment. I think we can just be more precise and use the term for the things that it is beneficial for, such as finding your folks. Not your parents, but like your folks, the people who are like you. But I really appreciate you all spending some time with me on this topic. This was a very interesting discussion. I had a feeling it might be relevant to some of us. Might be of interest. So how about we play a game in which the character definitely has some of the traits of neurodivergence. And by that, I mean Raphael Ambrosius Cousteau, the disco cop himself, the Disco Elysium.